If you're experiencing shoulder pain, usually you're going to hear these two things. One is a rotator cuff pain, and the other one is a shoulder bursitis pain. Now, their symptoms overlap a lot, so it's hard to determine which one is which. In this video, I'm going to tell you 3 key differences between the two, so you'll know if your pain is coming from the rotator cuff or if it's from your bursitis. First, let's start off with rotator cuff pain. Your rotator cuff pain most of the time is going to be localized on the shoulder going down the upper arm area. And the pain is triggered by active movements such as overhead activities, reaching behind the back, or resisted activities. And the treatment for rotator cuff pain may include rest, ice, and anti-inflammatory medications, but it can also require more intensive treatment such as physical therapy and possible surgery if you have a rotator cuff tear. If this is helpful to you so far, click on that subscribe button and turn on your notification. Now, let's talk about shoulder bursitis pain. Bursitis pain most of the time is localized on the shoulder area. Pain can be with active movement because of the inflammation, and it's going to be present with passive movement as well. And bursitis pain typically responds to rest, ice, and anti-inflammatory medications. Worst case scenario, the injection can help you. So let's recap. For rotator cuff pain, you usually will have the pain on the shoulder and down to the upper arm area. Pain is more with active movement, especially with overhead activities, reaching behind the back, and resistant activities. It may require more than just rest, ice, and anti-inflammatory medications in terms of treatment, which will include physical therapy and, in some cases, surgery for tendon tears. For bursitis pain, you're going to feel the pain localized on the shoulder area. Pain will be present with passive movement, and it often responds well to rest, ice, anti-inflammatory medications, and injections. If you're looking for exercises to help you with your shoulder pain, either rotator cuff or bursitis in origin, check out these videos here.